Hi, I'm Lila. I never really expected much from my sister's wedding, but I wasn't prepared to be placed at the table next to the coat rack. Literally. There I was, dressed in a navy jumpsuit I'd ironed twice and second-guessed 100 times. Alone, as usual. No +1. No real reason to be there, except for the guilt that buzzed like a fly I couldn't swat. The venue was stunning, of course. Westbridge Hall, the kind of place you book when you're trying to flex for a magazine feature. Crystal chandeliers, orchids in glass vases, candlelight dancing off the marble floor. All of it screamed perfection, or at least the kind of perfection you pay someone else to stage. They told me to check in at the front. The wedding planner, headset glued to her ear, flipped through a list and froze. Name? Lila Winters. She blinked. Oh, you're not. Then she caught herself and nodded quickly. Table 19. She pointed to a tiny makeshift two-seater in the far corner, next to the emergency exit. No name card, no flowers, just an awkward seat, dim lighting, and a clear message: you don't belong here. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I just smiled, said thank you, and sat down like I was supposed to. I watched as guests arrived. Laughter floated through the air like perfume. Champagne flutes clinked. Velvet suits, silk dresses, perfect teeth, imperfect grins. And then there was me, not even on the seating chart. The waiter walked past with a tray of hors d'oeuvre. He skipped my table. I almost laughed. Because of course. The weirdest part? I wasn't even surprised. This is how it's always been with my family. Especially with Nora, my golden child sister, the influencer, the voice of the family group chat, and apparently now, the queen of her wedding kingdom. When we were kids, they called me the quiet one, then the weird one, then just not at all. It didn't start with this wedding. It started when I was 12, and they forgot to pick me up from art camp. It continued when my photography portfolio was cute, but Nora's eyelash sponsorships were life-changing, and it never really stopped. What finally cracked me wasn't the seat placement. It wasn't the lack of champagne or the wilted salad I was eventually handed, like an afterthought. It was the text, "Can you shoot my wedding?" For free, of course. "Your family." That was the entire message. No hi, no thank you. Just Nora, casually tossing a request like she was asking me to bring napkins. The entitlement practically dripped off the screen. I didn't respond. Not at first. 2 days later, my phone rang. Mom. I should have let it go to voicemail. I didn't. "Lila," she said, syrupy and tight, "it's important to your sister. She really wants you to do this for her." Silence. "We're not asking much," she continued. "You know how much we've supported you. This is the least you can do." Supported me? Really? The last time I asked Mom to attend my gallery showcase, she said she was too tired, but she went to Nora's vitamin launch. In heels. Still, I said nothing. Old habit. I showed up to the wedding. Not with my camera, though. Just me. Small. Careful. Armored in indifference. And maybe deep down a stupid, flickering hope that I'd be seen. Spoiler. I wasn't. Nora walked past me in a silk robe, her hair in perfect waves, her makeup glowing. She looked straight at me, and then kept walking. I took a breath and checked my phone. A client had just approved my latest editorial, spread one I'd worked on for months. My biggest project to date. I locked the screen and slid the phone back into my purse. No one here cared. When the appetizers finally came out, the message was clear. Across the room, grilled lamb with mint chimichurri, scallops resting on edible flowers, wine pairings selected by sommeliers. At my table, a half-stale bread roll and some soggy spinach. No fork, no napkin, no apology. I stared at the plate, then up at the room. Not a single person looked at me. This wasn't forgetfulness. It was choreography. I was placed here, on purpose. So far from the center, I might as well have been a coat. They'd written me out of the story, but still expected me to smile in the family photos. I was an accessory, background filler, disposable, and they thought I wouldn't notice. But here's the thing. When you spend your whole life being invisible, you learn to pay attention. You learn to watch. You learn to listen. Nora passed by again. This time she stopped. "We kept it simple for you," she said sweetly, glancing at my sorry plate. "Didn't want to stress you out with all the options." I didn't speak. She leaned in, voice syrupy. "Smile for the camera, sis. Wouldn't want to ruin the aesthetic." Then she was gone, and I was left with my cold spinach, and a silence so loud it made my ears ring. But in that silence, something shifted. Not anger, not sadness, just clarity. A memory surfaced, one I hadn't thought about in years. Berlin, my first real solo exhibition. A gallery actually wanted to showcase my work. I told Dad. His reply, maybe don't get your hopes up. Art isn't really a stable path. I got the show, booked the flights, paid the costs. 3 days before the opening, I got an email from the curator. Unfortunately, we've decided to cancel. Best of luck. No explanation. Months later, I found out why. A family friend let it slip. Apparently, someone called the gallery, told them I was unstable, that I had a history of flaking, that I wasn't a good investment. It didn't take a genius to guess who made the call. I let it go. I always let it go. But tonight felt different. Because tucked inside my purse, zipped into a side pocket, was something I hadn't planned to bring. A silver USB drive with the truth. I didn't come to start a war, but maybe I didn't come to keep the peace either. And that right there, that moment when you realize you're done being quiet, that's when everything starts to change. I didn't touch the USB, not yet, but knowing it was there, that changed everything. Like having a fire extinguisher in a house full of candles. I didn't come here looking for a match, but maybe I was done pretending I couldn't smell the smoke. The orchestra started to play something soft and golden, a string quartet with just the right amount of melancholy. I scanned the room. Nora stood near the dessert table, holding court like she was born for this moment. Hair sculpted, dress hugging all the right angles, laughter bubbling from her like champagne. Next to her was Emery, her soon-to-be husband, tall, polished, carefully affable. He didn't look like someone who questioned things. He looked like someone who believed what he was told. I leaned back in my seat and tried to breathe past the taste of bitterness crawling up my throat. Then something weird happened. A guy at the next table knocked his phone off the edge. I bent to help, and that's when I noticed it. Nora's phone, sitting right there, screen up, message still open. She must have set it down without noticing. I didn't mean to look, but I did. One message. Tobin, can't wait till tonight. Just remember, you're mine, wedding or not. I blinked. Once. Twice. My brain took a full 5 seconds to catch up. Tobin? I hadn't heard that name in years. He was an ex, technically. A short-lived, hot mess of a situationship that ended when I realized he had less integrity than a soggy receipt. And now, he was texting my sister? My stomach turned. She wasn't just cheating. She was doing it tonight. On her wedding night. I sat frozen for a moment, watching her pose for selfies with Emery's mom like she wasn't actively dismantling his life behind his back. It was wild, how she could make betrayal look elegant. And suddenly I wasn't invisible anymore. I was watching. I excused myself and headed toward the hallway outside the main room. I needed air. I needed distance. But mostly, I needed to not explode in the middle of the reception. The hallway smelled like roses and floor polish. I leaned against the wall, trying to find something solid inside myself. Instead, I found another memory. 3 years ago, Manhattan. My first serious commission portraits of immigrant women for a nonprofit campaign. Raw, honest work. A huge opportunity. The night before the deadline, my laptop disappeared. I searched every inch of my apartment. Gone. 2 weeks of edits, vanished. I missed the deadline, lost the job. The campaign moved forward without me. 2 months later, I saw one of the photos unedited, watermarked on Nora's Instagram. Hashtag inspired by real stories. She'd never asked, never credited me, just lifted it. Like everything else, it hit me then, in that hallway. They didn't forget me, they used me, whenever it benefited them, and discarded me when it didn't. And now Nora was about to marry a man she was actively lying to, in front of everyone, surrounded by champagne and lilies and curated lighting. I went back into the reception and sat down at table 19, the exile spot. No one noticed. The speeches started, a round of toasts, nostalgic stories that skipped over anything messy, the version of our family that only existed in public. I reached into my clutch. My fingers brushed the USB. It wasn't burning. It wasn't vibrating. It was just waiting, like me. Then a voice I hadn't heard in years slid up behind me like a shadow. Lila, my mother, lipstick perfect, hair sprayed into sculpted submission, smile polished like a sales pitch. She touched my arm lightly. Let's not ruin Nora's moment, darling. I didn't reply. I heard you've been struggling. Again. Her voice was low, sweetly venomous. "Don't make a scene, Not here. Not tonight." She gave my arm a final squeeze and drifted away, like she hadn't just threatened me in soft tones. And that was the moment I knew. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about optics, because deep down, they knew exactly who they'd been to me. And if I ever stopped swallowing it, their whole house of cards might finally fall. Back at my table, I reached for my purse again. And this time, I didn't hesitate. I stood up and walked slowly toward the audiovisual booth at the back of the hall. The tech guy glanced up, startled. "There's a video that needs to play," I said quietly, "before the final toast." He hesitated. I don't think that's on the schedule. It is now." I held up the USB. Another pause. Then he took it, slid it into the laptop without asking questions. Behind me, the crowd was still smiling, still sipping, still pretending. They wouldn't be for long. I walked back to my seat. The room dimmed slightly. Guests murmured, confused, curious. A low rustle of expectation filled the air as the screen descended above the stage. I folded my hands in my lap. The first frame flickered on. Nora, on the boardwalk, laughing over her shoulder in a white dress, sun catching her curls. The perfect shot. Only it wasn't her shot. It was mine. No credit line, no watermark, no permission, just one more thing she'd taken. The next frame, Nora's engagement party. Champagne tower, flashbulbs. Then cut. A video clip. Her stepping away from Emery, checking her phone. The screen zoomed in. "Tobin, can't wait till tonight. Just remember, you're mine. Wedding or not." Time-stamped, dated, clear. The room sucked in a breath like a collective gasp. I watched Emery. His jaw tensed. His face went pale. And Nora? She just stared. Another cut. Audio this time. Dad's voice. She's creative, sure, but too unstable. Wouldn't trust her with anything important. Then my mother, to a friend. Lila's shows are niche. I mean, let's be honest, who buys that kind of art? And finally, Nora laughing on a podcast. Honestly, people give way too much credit to photographers. It's just clicking a button, right? The lights stayed dim. No one moved. I stood, walked toward the mic at the front of the room. "Hi," I said. "I'm Lila." In case anyone forgot, nervous laughter. Mostly silence. I didn't show up to ruin anything. I showed up because I finally realized maybe I'm not the problem. I paused, looked straight at Nora. "You called me dramatic, difficult, but I was just inconvenient. And now, I'm done." I stepped back. The crowd sat stunned. No applause, no outbursts, just impact. And in the stillness that followed, a single truth settled over everything like dust. They didn't silence me. They just underestimated how loud the truth can be when it's finally told. The silence after I spoke wasn't empty. It was thick, full of unsaid things, full of weight. And then Emery stood up. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He just turned and looked at Nora like he was seeing her for the very first time and not liking what he found. "Did you ever love me?" he asked, quiet, almost kind. Nora opened her mouth, mascara starting to smudge beneath her lower lashes. He didn't wait for the answer. He slipped the silver ring off his finger and set it gently on the table, like it was breakable, like he was. Then he walked away. No shouting, no drama, just gone. The room shifted. The Winston matriarch, Nora's future mother-in-law, stood with the kind of spine only money and pride can straighten. "This family," she said, voice cold and cutting, "will not be tied to deception." Then she left too. Pearls stiff against her neck. Her husband followed, tight-lipped. Somewhere behind them, someone's phone started ringing. No one answered it. I stood still, watching as the pieces began to fall, like dominoes tipped by the truth. One clip, one sentence, one moment of refusal to keep swallowing the lie. Dad looked stunned, like he'd just realized people had ears. Mom Rochelle was already in motion. She pushed through a cluster of guests, reaching me in record time. Her heels clicked like a countdown. "You think you're brave?" she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "You embarrassed your sister. You embarrassed all of us." I didn't flinch. "No," I said, "I revealed you. There's a difference." She didn't answer, just stared, the way you look at something that's no longer useful. And then she left too. For a moment, I thought Nora might follow her, but she didn't. She just sat down, right there, in the middle of her perfect wedding. The dress that once shimmered now looked like it was crushing her. The smile was gone. The filters were gone. And she looked real, not sorry, not even angry, just exposed. And I didn't feel triumph. I felt free. My phone buzzed again. A text from a number I didn't know. Saw the wedding clip. If you ever want to collaborate again, we'd be honored to show your work. JW Monterey Studio, another buzz. Vincent told me what happened. You were right to speak. Let's talk cover options, LD. Chronicle review. I exhaled slowly. For years, I'd carried the weight of their words, their indifference, their sabotage. I'd bent myself around their convenience, trying not to take up too much space. But space was mine now. And not because they gave it to me, because I took it back. Later that night, after most of the guests had slipped out through side doors or found excuses to disappear, I returned to my little table in the corner, table 19. Still no name card, just crumbs and a folded napkin. My USB was there, tucked beneath the linen like a discarded secret. I picked it up, slid it into my purse. Empty now. No more hidden truths. No more waiting for permission. Just clarity. I thought that would be the end of it, that I'd leave and never hear from them again. But endings, I've learned, don't always arrive when you expect them to. Sometimes they linger. Sometimes they knock again just to make sure. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was my mother. I stared at her name on the screen for a long time before answering. Lila, she said, all silk and sorrow. I think we all said things we didn't mean. I stayed quiet. We'd like to move forward. As a family. I didn't roll my eyes. I didn't scream. I just said, your version of family is not one I recognize anymore. She paused, then added, softer. We've reflected. Your father and I. I almost laughed. They hadn't reflected. They'd been exposed. We hope you'll come around, she said. I didn't reply. Just ended the call. Not angry. Just done. That same week, a letter arrived, handwritten, from my father. The man who once called my art unstable, in an email to a gallery I hadn't even told him about. It didn't say sorry. It said, we hope someday you'll understand what we tried to do. I read it once. Then again. I folded it in half and slid it into a drawer I rarely open, because that's where it belongs. Not in my heart, in a file labeled lessons. And then, just when I thought the echoes had faded, Nora showed up. Rainy afternoon, no warning, no makeup, hair pulled back, jacket soaked. She knocked twice, then stood there like someone waiting to be judged. I'm not here to explain, she said. Good, I replied, stepping aside. I need work. I didn't say anything, just looked at her. She looked smaller without the spotlight. Her voice was thinner now. No filters, no sponsors, no curated captions. Just her, the raw version. You know, I said, you could have called first. I didn't think you'd pick up. Fair point. I let her into the studio. It smelled like turpentine and varnish and rain. Caleb, my assistant, glanced up from the editing station, but didn't say anything. Nora stood in the gallery space like a stranger. The walls were lined with portraits. Real people, real stories. People who had let me see them. I don't need forgiveness, she whispered. I just need to start over. I studied her face. Not for symmetry, not for perfection, for sincerity. Show up early, I said. Clean everything. Don't expect to be seen. She nodded. And this time, I added, you earn your way into the frame. She didn't flinch. That night, I stood on the rooftop of the studio. The sky was that strange color between dusk and hope. Lights blinked across Brooklyn like quiet affirmations. Caleb joined me, steaming mug in hand. So, he asked, what's next? I thought about it. Portraits of people who thought they were invisible. Portraits of women who were always asked to smile, but never to speak. Portraits of me. I'm calling it Reborn in Focus, I said. He raised his mug. To clarity. I smiled. Not because I was healed, not because everything was fine, but because I'd finally stopped asking for a seat at their table and built my own. A week passed before she spoke again. Nora. She was sweeping the studio hallway when I walked in one morning, head down, hair in a low knot, wearing old sneakers in silence. We hadn't said much since she started helping out. No grand apologies, no fake smiles, just a mutual understanding that words were cheap. Time was currency now. She showed up on time. kept quiet, cleaned without being asked, carried lighting kits when needed, wrapped cables, stacked chairs. Invisible in the way I'd once been. I won't lie, part of me liked watching her learn how that felt. But another part, the softer part I rarely showed, understood something else. Survival humbles everyone differently. Late one evening, the studio was quiet. The final portrait for the new exhibit was nearly finished, an image of a former dancer, now using a cane, framed in soft light with her reflection just visible behind her. Nora stood nearby, gently dusting frames. "I never understood your work," she said suddenly. Not defensive, not cruel, just honest. "I didn't look up. You always said it wasn't about posing. It was about catching what was already there. But I didn't get it. I kept adjusting the lighting. Let her keep going. I think. I never wanted to see anything I couldn't control." That made me pause. Because for the first time, she wasn't performing. "I stole from you," she added. "More than just photos." I still didn't answer. But my silence wasn't angry. It was space. A silence made of listening, not absence. She didn't fill it with excuses, just left it there. Let it breathe. That's how I knew she meant it. The next morning, Caleb was editing in the back when he called out, "You might want to see this." I walked over. He tilted his screen toward me. A new blog post. The sister who spoke, art, betrayal, and the power of telling the truth. It had gone viral overnight. Someone had filmed my speech at the wedding. Not the projection, just the moment I stood at the mic. Just the words I said. The comment section was wild. This gave me chills. I've been that sibling too. I don't even know her, but I'm crying. She didn't destroy a wedding. She saved herself. People weren't just watching. They were seeing, and they understood. I wasn't background anymore. That night, I stood in the gallery, alone. The new exhibit was nearly ready. Reborn in Focus was etched in silver on the entrance wall. Each photo was a piece of a larger breath, a new story told, with light and shadow. Not all of the subjects were strangers. One portrait showed a woman with tear stains drying on her cheeks, her eyes tired but defiant. That was Jasmine, once shamed by her church after coming out, now running a youth shelter downtown. Another showed a man with deep frown lines, holding a guitar across his lap. Darren used to busk outside the train station until someone in our building complained. I hired him for our opening, and one frame, near the end, showed Nora, sweeping the gallery floor, unaware the shot was being taken, the lighting soft, the image honest. When she saw it a few days later, she didn't say anything, just stood there, studying it. "You didn't ask my permission," she said eventually. I nodded. "Neither did you." She let out a quiet laugh. Not bitter, not cruel, just tired. "You gonna use it?" "Yes." She looked at the photo again, then said something that surprised me. "Good. It's true." That was all, and it was enough. The night of the exhibit's opening arrived quietly. The kind of quiet that hums just before something meaningful begins. Guests drifted in slowly. Friends, collectors, strangers who'd seen the clip online and wanted to see the rest of the story. Someone played soft acoustic guitar in the corner. Jasmine stood near her portrait, talking with a group of women who looked like they'd fought their own battles too. Darren performed with his eyes closed, music pouring from him like breath. And me? I didn't hide. I walked the room. I answered questions. I smiled, not the practiced one, but the kind you forget you're wearing. I belonged here. I'd built this. A woman approached me near the center display. Mid-40s, stylish but warm. Her eyes were damp, and she held a tissue balled in one hand. "I just wanted to say, thank you," she said. "Your story, it's mine too. Different details, but the same ache." I nodded. "It's why I told it." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And I'm finally telling mine." Later that evening, Nora brought me a cup of ginger tea. She didn't speak, just handed it to me and walked away. Small steps. Not reconciliation, not repair, but truth in motion. I stood by the window as the gallery emptied. The street outside was wet, reflecting neon signs like paint strokes on glass. The city was loud, alive, and I was no longer shrinking from it. I checked my phone. A voicemail blinked, from Rochelle. I didn't press play, I just deleted it, because some stories don't need sequels. They just need closure. When I turned back around, Nora was putting away folding chairs. Quiet, present. I picked up one beside her. She glanced over, then said, "Do you think?" I'll ever be more than what I pretended to be? I thought for a second. Depends on what you build next. She nodded, eyes flicking to the photo of herself near the wall. Then I guess I better start building. We worked in silence after that. Not heavy, not tense, just real. That's the thing they never told us about healing. It doesn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it just feels like sweeping a floor with someone who used to ignore your name. It's strange how fast things settle after they explode. Not into calm, not into comfort, just into clarity. The wedding fallout became its own quiet headline. Not in the tabloids, Nora was never that famous, but in whispers, private texts, unsent emails, conversations with people who'd always known but never said it out loud. Turns out, truth doesn't just echo, it spreads. I thought once the wedding dust cleared, I'd feel relief. Instead, I felt space. The kind you don't notice until it's yours again. A few weeks later, I got a message from a former professor. She'd seen the viral clip, then visited the exhibit. "It's not just art anymore, Lila," she wrote. "It's testimony." That word stuck with me. Testimony. Not revenge, not performance. Just someone finally saying, "This is what happened," and letting the world sit with it. That became the undercurrent of everything I worked on after the show. Not just telling stories, witnessing them. I got invited to speak at a creative conference in Seattle. First time anyone had ever asked me to represent my work without asking me to also be palatable. No filters. No softened language. I said yes. Before the flight, I found myself standing in front of the mirror. Black boots, gray wool coat, hair unstyled but real. I looked older. Maybe not in years, but in weight. And for the first time in forever, I didn't mind. At the airport, I bumped into someone I hadn't seen in years, my cousin Nadine. We were close once, before the family dynamic split everyone into factions. She looked surprised to see me. "I saw the video," she said, pulling her scarf tighter. "I watched it 5 times. I didn't know what to say." "You weren't wrong," she added. "We all just pretended you were." There it was again, that quiet ripple. Truth, floating downstream, landing wherever it was meant to. Seattle was misty and honest. The conference hall was packed with writers, photographers, documentarians, people who lived by observation. I stood on stage, hands steady for once, and I spoke about shame, about silence, about how sometimes the hardest thing isn't speaking, it's believing. You have the right to be heard. When I finished, a man in the front row stood and asked, "How did you know it was time?" I didn't hesitate. When staying silent finally cost more than the fallout. He nodded, but I saw it in his eyes. He was still calculating his cost. Back home, things shifted, but not dramatically. Nora kept showing up, still quiet, still doing the work. She never asked for a title, never complained. Sometimes I caught her watching the clients, especially the ones who reminded her of versions of herself. She didn't try to insert herself anymore. One afternoon, she passed me a folder of photos she'd taken on her phone, all candid, clean framing, surprisingly decent composition. "I've been watching how you catch light," she said. I looked through them. They weren't bad. "You have an eye," I told her. Her face changed, like someone just handed her something she didn't think she'd ever be allowed to hold. "Maybe you could teach me. Properly," she added. I thought about it, then nodded. "Only if you're okay learning from the background first," she smiled. "That's the only place I trust now." That weekend, she helped me prep for a community workshop. We were setting up portrait sessions for women rebuilding after abusive relationships. They'd been referred through a local shelter. The room buzzed with nervous energy strangers, unsure if they were meant to be photographed, unsure if they were even allowed to be seen. Nora helped with tea, blankets, warm lighting. One of the women, Sharita, refused to be photographed at first. She sat in the back, arms crossed, eyes darting like a cornered bird. Nora brought her tea. No pressure, no pitch, just warmth. They sat for a while. I watched from across the room. Eventually, Sharita stood up, walked over. "I think I'm ready," she said. We adjusted the lights. She sat stiffly at first, then slowly, so slowly, let her shoulders lower. Click, pause, click again. Her eyes didn't smile, but they softened. Afterward, she looked at the proof and whispered, "I've never looked like myself before." That sentence settled in me like stone. It became the caption under her portrait at our next show. "I've never looked like myself before." And maybe that's what this was all about. Not revenge. Not even redemption. Just recognition. Later that night, after the guests were gone and the lights were dimmed, I sat alone in the gallery, feet aching, heart full. Nora appeared in the doorway. She held a worn notebook, hesitated. "I found this," she said, "in Mom's attic last week. It's yours." She handed it over. My old journal, brown leather, spine cracked. I hadn't seen it in over a decade. Inside were sketches, photo ideas, bits of poems, some angry, some scared, some unfinished. And near the middle, a scribbled sentence from when I was 16. "Maybe if I disappear enough, they'll finally notice I'm missing." I sat with that line for a long time, then closed the journal gently, as if comforting a younger version of myself. Nora didn't speak, just sat beside me, the way I used to sit beside her before piano recitals, back when I still believed applause meant love. We didn't need to talk. Not every wound wants a conversation. Sometimes presence is enough. That night, before locking up, I pinned a print near the exit door, a self-portrait, black and white, grainy, me not posed, not styled, just me, arms crossed, tired, unfiltered. Underneath, I wrote, "The girl they forgot to frame." No spotlight, no caption wall, just truth. Let people see it as they left. Let them wonder why the girl in the shadows was finally standing in the light. The first snowfall came early that year. I was at the studio, standing by the window, watching flakes drift past the glass like soft punctuation marks. The kind of snow that doesn't stick, just lingers, reminding you the world's still shifting. Inside, it was warm. The walls were lined with new work. Portraits of people who'd stepped out of silence in their own ways. Some through tears, some through art, some just by showing up. Nora was across the room, adjusting frames for the next exhibit. She didn't ask for credit anymore. She didn't shrink either. She just moved careful, steady, like someone trying to build something she wouldn't need to run from. It had been nearly 6 months since the wedding. No one else from the family had reached out, except once, a letter, hand-delivered. No return address, but I knew the handwriting, Rochelle's. Neat, like her life was still under control. I didn't open it right away. For a week, it sat on my desk, untouched. Then one morning, with my coffee half cold and my heart oddly still, I opened it. "Lila, I don't know if this will matter to you anymore, but I want you to understand. We were scared, not of you, but of what your voice could undo. Your truth was a mirror we spent years avoiding. That doesn't excuse what we did. I can't undo the silences, or the seats you were never given. But I do see it now. I see you. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope someday you feel peace." Rochelle, it wasn't an apology. Not really. But it was an acknowledgement. And maybe that's what healing sometimes looks like, receiving something you don't need and still letting it land without bitterness. I didn't write back, not out of spite, but because some echoes don't need an answer. They just need a place to rest. The night of the exhibit, the studio filled slowly. No velvet ropes, no flashbulbs, just people, real ones. Teachers, nurses, musicians, survivors, the kind of folks who knew how to carry pain without turning it into a weapon. Each photo had a quote beside it, not mine. The subjects, words they chose, words that helped them reclaim what the world had once taken. Sharita's was there, so was Jasmine's, even Nora's. A photo she took herself, a mirror shot, raw and unfiltered. In her own writing underneath, "I used to live for the reflection. Now I live past it." People stopped and stared at hers longer than I expected. One woman whispered, "That's how it starts, isn't it? Seeing past the version you sold." I smiled. Exactly. Later that evening, someone tapped my shoulder. An older man, soft-spoken, press badge on his coat. He introduced himself as a journalist for an independent media project covering creative resilience. "Your work," he said, "it's not just portraits, it's reclamation." I didn't know how to respond to that, but I let it sit because maybe that was the point. The gallery lights dimmed slightly as the final part of the exhibit came into view, a series called Unframed. Photos without borders, no titles, no names, just images pinned directly to the wall, some crooked on purpose. Mine was the last one. The self-portrait from table 19, grainy, dim, taken that same night, just before I left the wedding. I'd stood in front of the exit door, camera angled high, face half-shadowed, alone, uncelebrated, real. I hadn't meant to keep it. But something about that image refused to be deleted. Beneath it, instead of a quote, just one line written in lowercase, "I didn't ruin the story." I wrote a new one. After the show, we cleaned up. Stacked chairs, packed cords, the usual. Nora and I didn't say much, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence anymore. It was something else. A kind of unspoken agreement. Whatever we'd been, this was what we were now. As we turned out the lights, she paused near the exit. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not keeping me out, even when you had every reason to." I shrugged. "People change." She looked at me. "You didn't change, you just stopped folding." That landed. In the way truths often do when someone else says what you've been carrying all along. We stepped outside. The snow had thickened. I tilted my head back, let a flake land on my cheek. Nora shoved her hands into her coat. "Do you think Mom will ever come around?" I looked down the street. The city glowing in layers, shop windows, traffic signals, warm kitchen lights behind curtains. "I think she'll keep pretending she wasn't wrong," I said. "Because that's easier than admitting she didn't see me." Nora nodded. "She sees you now. Maybe. But that's not the point anymore." "What is?" "That I don't need her to." And that was it. That was the shift. Weeks passed. Then months. The gallery thrived. We partnered with local schools, hosted artist circles, opened the back room for drop-in portrait therapy sessions on Sunday afternoons. People came not because they knew my name, but because they knew what the space held. Not ego, not perfection, just space to be seen. I received a message one morning from a girl in Montana. She'd watched the wedding clip again and again. She sent me a photo she'd taken of herself in her bedroom mirror. She said it was the first time she saw someone worth photographing, another from a man in soul. He thanked me for showing how survival doesn't have to roar. Sometimes it whispers, and that's enough. I kept every message, not as trophies, but as reminders of what happens when one person stops performing and starts telling the truth. You don't just free yourself. You break open a door for others to walk through. One night, long after closing, I sat on the rooftop, wrapped in a thick sweater, mug of tea warming my hands. The city was quiet, just the occasional siren in the distance, a dog bark echoing somewhere below. In my lap was the old photo again. The one from when Nora and I were kids, she in her ballet outfit, me blurred in the background. This time, I didn't feel the sting. I just stared at it like an artifact, a small moment that no longer owned me. Then I did something unexpected. I got up, went downstairs and framed it. Not out of nostalgia, but out of peace, because that's what healing taught me. You don't always have to destroy the past. Sometimes, you just need to frame it correctly so it stops defining you. And as I hung it near the back of the gallery, tucked into a quiet corner only I ever noticed, I wrote one last line underneath. I built the table they never offered me. And you? If you're still waiting for your seat, build your own. We'll save you a spot. Story 2. This is the tale of the night. My family finally acknowledged that I didn't belong. My name is Sloan. I expected to rejoice, to grin for the cameras, to do what I usually did when I arrived to my sister's wedding. Act like the virtuous daughter. However, I sensed something was wrong as soon as I entered. Then I noticed it. My chair, shoved outside by the coat racks, not in the main hall, not at the family table. I initially believed it to be an error, but it wasn't. There was a message that you are unimportant. The problem with ignoring someone for too long, though, is this. They eventually gave up on attempting to blend in. So that evening, I made a decision. What followed? Let's just say that everyone was taken aback. With my fingers holding the steering wheel a bit too firmly, I drove into the venue's parking lot. In the center of Chicago, a 5-star ballroom with marble flooring, sparkling chandeliers, and flowers more expensive than my rent. This wedding exuded elegance in every way. Everything, excluding me. Taking a big breath, I smoothed down my navy blue dress as I got out of my car. I wasn't here to stir things up. Making this about me was not my purpose. I had long since come to terms with the fact that I wasn't Odessa's favorite sibling, and it was her day. I simply didn't anticipate their reminding me of it in such a humiliating, public manner. I was met at the check-in counter by a wedding planner who seemed too happy to be serious. She chirped to Sloan. I spoke in a steady, composed tone. Sloan Hathaway. Her smile wavered slightly. As she flipped over the seating list, my gut grew tense. Then her face flashed in some way. "I feel sorry." That look seemed familiar to me. I detested that expression. "Yes, exactly. You're here." As she handed me a tiny place card, she added, "You are sitting over here." After a moment of hesitation, she gestured toward a corridor that was just beyond the opulent ballroom. I scowled. "I'm sorry." She faked a second grin. "Just beyond the main reception area is where your table is." Harold Hathaway, Vivian, and the enormous seating chart on the stand next to her caught my attention. The bride and groom were sat at the front, near to my parents. There were seats inside for Dominic's distant relatives, Odessa's closest friends, and even his co-worker's girlfriend. There was no sign of my name. I looked at the planner once more. Something must be wrong. She tightened her grin. "Regretfully, it is the seat you have been allotted." I felt a gradual heat in my chest. Not in the ballroom, not even at a table far away. No, they had pushed me into the hall like I was a visitor, an afterthought. It was duty, not family, that forced them to make accommodations. Nevertheless, I had the absurd hope that this was only a mistake and that perhaps, just possibly, my own mother had prevented this from occurring. I saw her standing with Odessa on the other side of the room, grinning while she worried over her outfit. As always, my sister seemed gorgeous, flawless, and loved. Odessa grinned after catching my eye and tilting her head. I knew all I needed to know from that sneer. I pushed myself ahead. "Mom," I said, speaking lightly, "could I speak to you for a moment?" Vivian hardly looked at me. "No, sweetheart, this is not the moment. We're busy, don't you see?" "It will be only a moment." I clenched my teeth and said. With a frustrated but compliant sigh, she moved aside. Naturally, Odessa remained still. She only observed her grin expanding. I responded, "I just checked my seat. The hallway is where it is," Vivian hummed dismissively. At the main table, we had to give priority to our immediate relatives. "Sloan," I blinked, "close relatives." "My family is my direct relatives." Vivian chuckled artificially, like though I had said something ridiculous. "Don't be too emotional, my love." At last, Odessa spoke. "Was your seat messed up?" "Whoa, that's a shame." There was fake pity in her words. "You are aware of how hectic wedding preparations can be. So many small details. Things are forgotten." Her enjoyment radiated from her gaze. This was no accident, she knew. I looked back to my mom. "Do you really believe that I can sit outside the reception hall, away from everyone, Mom?" Vivian groaned once again, obviously tired with the discussion. "Don't make a big deal out of this, Sloan. Odessa has a wonderful day today. Simply express gratitude for being here." Feeling thankful, bitter and unsaid, the words stuck in my throat. "Thank you for treating me like a second-class visitor at my own sister's wedding. Be thankful that you were cast aside, ignored, and forgotten." I parted my lips. At last, though, Harold, my father, my ever-passive, avoidant father spoke. "Sweetheart, it's just simmering." Without even glancing at me, he said, "Don't spoil the atmosphere." That was it. That was his only statement. I didn't even think to answer. What was the purpose? The quiet was broken by a fresh voice. "That setup is intriguing." Dominic's mother, Celeste, was standing close by when I turned. I'm holding a glass of champagne. Her gaze shifted from me to Odessa and back again. Her face was unreadable. Odessa tensed up a little. Vivian smiled politely and with practice at her. "Celeste, oh Celeste, you are aware of how difficult it may be to arrange a wedding. We made every effort to make accommodations for everyone." Unpersuaded, Celeste hummed. She gave me a brief glance, too much time, as though deciphering the text. That meant nothing to me yet. However, I maintained eye contact with her. Odessa skillfully steered the conversation away by looping her arm through my mother. "We really ought to check on the cake before the reception begins, Mom." Then I was fired without warning. Around me, the ballroom erupted in music, clinking glasses and laughter, a celebration I wasn't really a part of. I wasn't welcome, but I was here. I turned to leave. My heart was pounding, but not in the direction of the hallway or the table I was assigned. Staring at my name in beautiful cursive, I reached for the place card in my hand. I slowly placed it on a nearby tray after turning it over once, and then again. They didn't know me at all if they assumed. I would simply accept this. With my back against the chilly wall, and my fingers clenched around the hem of my dress. I gaze at the dimly lighted corridor. The grand ballroom is filled with distant music, clinking glasses, and laughter, a world I was never truly a part of. The seclusion isn't new. The shame, albeit greater this time, feels eerily familiar, like an old wound being cut open again. This wasn't an accident. They wanted me to feel small, insignificant, and darn it, they succeeded. The hurt in my chest extends not only from this moment, but from years of being the second option, the afterthought. My mind goes back, drawing me into the past before I can stop it. 3 years ago, I was back at my parents' house, going through my old bedroom. I hadn't gone home in a long, and it showed dust accumulated in corners. My childhood books undisturbed, the framed images on the wall frozen in time. High school, college, everything before I quit trying. I wasn't hunting for anything in particular, just passing time while my mother completed whatever lavish supper she was cooking for Odessa's arrival. Odessa was always in the center. Then I noticed it, a little leather notepad protruding from my mother's bedside table. Something about the way it was tucked inside, as though it were significant, made me grab for it inside even though I was on the verge of not opening it. Pages and pages of well-documented recollections, notes, opinions, birthdays, accomplishments, challenges, favorite meals, names of childhood pals, and even a record of presents she had adored and ones she pretended to like out of courtesy. I turned the pages again, looking for anything about myself. Nothing was present, not even a reference, not a single idea. She made no mention of her second daughter. I didn't seem to be there. A lifetime of uncertainty was abruptly validated in print as I stood there, clutching the notepad till my hands hurt. My mother hardly responded when she entered. "You've always been self-sufficient, honey. Odessa, I've never had to worry about you as much as I do now." As if that were meant to be a praise. As if the years of silent neglect would be erased by that. She had documented every detail of Odessa, but it wasn't worth recording a single thought about me. I realized then that I had always been the only one in this household. Around me, the present slams back. The air was cut like a razor by the sound of Odessa's laughing. My chest feels the weight of that fucking notepad. I still look at my designated table. The harshness, the pettiness, and the insult. Should they wish to remind me of my position? I got the message. I take a deep breath and push myself away from the wall. Perhaps it was time to pretend that I didn't belong if my family had already made that determination. My thoughts are racing as I move toward the ballroom. However, I see Dominic before I even get to the doorway. He is standing away from the bar, holding a tumbler of whiskey, but he isn't sipping it. He isn't looking around the audience with the ease of someone who recently got married to the love of his life. Instead, they are clearly hesitant and focused on something or someone. Then they fall upon me. He lets out a long, deep breath, then pushes off the counter and comes over to me. Sloan. Despite the evenness of his voice, there's something behind it. My eyebrows go up. For a time, Dominic, none of us says anything. Around us, the wedding continues. As the party's foundation gradually deteriorates beneath it, people are drinking, laughing, and celebrating as it moves on. Odessa is holding court on the far side of the room, enjoying her own reflection as Dominic shifts, rolling the whiskey glass in his palm before turning to look at her. His jaw clenches as he turns back to face me. Once more, there it is. That hesitancy, that uncertainty. Sloan. His voice is lower as he begins. This time, although we haven't spoken much, may I ask you a question? I cock my head. It depends. Is this something else, or is it just a courteous wedding conversation? He is not smiling, not even pretending. Something changes within me. Dominic rubs his temple and sighs as if he already regrets this. When I'm not around, does your sister ever speak about me differently? It's there, that one query. That instant when, for a brief moment, reality breaks through the illusion Odessa has been feeding him. I think about lying, perhaps out of a misguided feeling of security. Maybe because presenting the truth in a context like this is a risky thing. But then I recall my seat assignment. I recall Odessa's sneer. I recall my mother's dismissal. And I remember who Odessa truly is. I gaze at his whiskey glass. You should probably take a taste of that first. Dominic tenses. Then he brings the glass to his lips and downs the whole thing. Dominic, I say cautiously, I don't think you know Odessa as well as you think you do. His jaw tightens. I was frightened about it. Silence spreads between us, dense and stifling. She's been acting weird, he eventually admits. His voice was softer now, with a hint of control and displeasure. She doesn't want me to see some things. Of course there are, which makes my stomach turn. Before I can answer, Celeste shows up. She is approaching us. Her eyes were unfathomable, despite her expression. Her eyes are calculating and piercing. The only lady in this room with more authority than Odessa is her new mother-in-law. Celeste pauses before Dominic. She briefly glanced in my direction before focusing on him. "Darling," she says with ease, "I think you ought to watch this." She then extends her phone. Dominic accepts it reluctantly, his expression changing from bewilderment to insight to something far worse. Odessa's text messages to her stylist, friends, and others who shouldn't know what's going on in her heart since it's rotten and chilly. The messages are harsh, trivial, and unkind. Celeste is being disparaged by Odessa, who calls her domineering and intrusive. She is a wealthy, elderly woman who should simply pay the checks and get out of her life. Odessa talks about Dominic, how she is teaching him to be the spouse she needs, and how he would do everything she asks of him because he is so anxious to outdo his father. The worst one comes next. "Odessa, I'm laughing at how simple this marriage will be. Since Dominic's family is wealthy, she just needs to fulfill her role until it is no longer necessary." Dominic's hand grips the phone tightly. Celeste keeps a close eye on him. "Dominic, your future bride doesn't simply despise me." Her voice is quiet yet as harsh as glass when she stops. "From the beginning, she has been plotting to dominate you." As though the floor underneath him has suddenly burst open, Dominic wobbles a little. "Since this isn't my moment, I remain silent." He owns this. I simply observe his face change from uncertainty to rage. Even if the wedding is taking place, the foundation is already crumbling. Even if the wedding is still in the works, the subsequent family gathering will completely alter the situation behind closed doors. We are led into a private lounge, and I see the bodies moving. The tension in the air is thick and heavy, causing your skin to itch. In the middle of it all, Odessa is poised, or at least acting that way. Celeste is standing close to the door, lips squeezed together in an unreadable line, arms crossed. Dominic stands near the bar, his shoulders stiff, his whiskey unopened. Naturally, Vivian is already talking, smoothing already. Excuses are already being made. With a faint, forced grin, she continues, "This is all just a misunderstanding." The level of emotions is high. After all, it's a wedding. Let's avoid any family strife. Celeste interrupts her. Friction among the family. Her eyes narrow as she echoes, "This isn't tension, Vivian. This is enlightening." Odessa crosses her arms over her costly gown and scoffs mockingly. "Is this really why you brought us in here?" She turns to face Dominic, her voice brimming with sweetness. "Sweetheart, tell me that you don't genuinely think this is absurd." Dominic doesn't respond. He doesn't even give her a glance. Reaching for his arm, Vivian does so. She spoke more softly now. "You must understand, Dominic, my dear. Odessa has experienced a great deal of stress. It is really draining to plan a wedding. Individuals make unintentional statements." Celeste seemed to mean every word when she spoke about dominating him, which is why her lips curled in a weird way. Odessa's jaw clenches, but Harold speaks before she can respond, and the room falls silent. "Stop, Vivian." Though they are faint, the words have a gunshot-like impact. As though taken aback by the interruption, my mother turns and blinks. My father is not a loud-mouthed man, a man who doesn't step in. But this evening, something changes tonight. With a weary, heavy voice, he replies, "You've protected Odessa her entire life. I have no idea where it is, and see what she has become as a result." With a look of real disbelief on her face, Odessa gasps, "You're siding with her, Dad." Harold turns away from her and toward me. Sloane has always been correct. I can still hear the words. My mother recoils physically from my breath. In my life, for the first time, my dad is picking me. As though this is a mistake, Vivian laughs uneasily and shakes her head. "Don't be silly, Harold." Odessa lies. Before he even realizes it, Dominic says. His voice sounds unpolished, as if he's only now realizing that he's been sleeping next to an unfamiliar person. Odessa turns pallid. "Please pardon me." I slowly move forward and meet my mother's gaze. Right now I need her to understand. I want her to suffer the consequences. "I whispered to you that you will lose more than just me if you continue to cover for her. Mom. This is the first time that Vivian goes wrong. When Odessa sees it, she becomes alarmed. Desperation begins to seep into her voice, sharpening it. Because of her, all of you are turning against me. Before striking the last blow, Celeste exhales slowly and takes a sip of her drink. We are now seeing you for who you truly are, which is why we are turning against you. Odessa flinches physically, her eyes darting from face to face and her breath trembling. She's always had the upper hand. So far, the most deadly form of animal is one that is injured, and Odessa is not going down in peace. The private lounge's air is oppressive, tinged with something sharp and electric. Nobody moves. Nobody says anything, as though any abrupt movement may explode. The room was coiling with tension. Odessa remains still. Her fingers gripped the fabric of her gown so firmly that the seams strained, and her breath was short. She is aware that she is losing control. Vivian holds her daughter's arm tightly. She spoke in a low, frantic voice. "Stop, Odessa!" Odessa doesn't stop, though. She is unable to. She refuses. Dominic has not spoken across the room. His silence has more weight than any charge, a burden bearing down on Odessa's meticulously constructed universe. I give him a quick look. The man who just promised my sister he would be with her forever. I can also see the uncertainty in his eyes, beyond a reasonable doubt. Something colder, disgust, a glimmer of fulfillment. My chest is ablaze. However I bury it, it's not over yet. Not quite yet. Odessa lets out a short breath and looks at me, eyes squinted. Don't you think you're really intelligent? There is a tremble beneath her serene, controlled voice. I look her in the eye. Odessa, I don't need to think. Her lips curve, and I know it's not a grin. Something more brittle, something darker. I've always made you jealous. It's such a ridiculous charge. I nearly chuckle at how predictable it is. Nearly. I tilt my head instead. What is the object of jealousy? The necessity of lying and manipulation to keep others in your circle. I point at Dominic, to Celeste. To our own parents. Examine Odessa. Your world is getting smaller. I go for the kill as her jaw tightens. You did a good job playing your game, I said, even measured voice. However, you overlooked one point. I am aware of your true identity. Odessa recoils. It's there, but it's subtle. Vivian takes a deep breath. I'm not bluffing. She understands that. I take a step forward. I spoke softly yet firmly. I know about the money, the written word, the remarks you made regarding your own spouse. I give Dominic a quick look. Your remarks regarding his family. Dominic tenses up. The color fades from Odessa's face. My mother then begs me for the first time in her life. Vivian turns, her hands shaking and her eyes wide. Sloane, she murmurs. You still have her as your sister. This is not required of you. There is some silence, and for a brief moment, I hesitate not because I feel sorry for Odessa, but because this is the first time my mother has ever looked at me in this way. As if she is in need of me, as if she's terrified. However, the hesitancy is brief, because I know if the roles were reversed, Odessa wouldn't hesitate, and she proves it when she snaps. Because of her, all of you are turning against me. Odessa's voice sounds shrill and rough, her hands quivering at her sides. She's always been bitter, always despised me. And now you're going to believe her over your own daughter. Celeste exhales gently, elevating her glass to her lips before administering the fatal blow. We are now seeing you for who you truly are, which is why we are turning against you. It was a slap of words. Odessa's mouth opens, then closes. She glances at Dominic, her final shot at control. Her voice shakes as she reaches for him. You don't believe them, do you? Dominic doesn't answer that. Quiet. It's her death sentence. Odessa's respiration hitches, her terror apparent now and then. She lunges forward, her face contorted in rage. But I'm not going to back down this time. I hardly flinch as Odessa's hand swings recklessly and quickly at me. I'm not required to relocate. I don't need to be afraid, since it is now evident how different we are from one another. I no longer feel terrified. Everyone in this room is aware that Odessa is losing control. Her hand pierces the atmosphere with a burst of rage and despair. Celeste, however, gets in the way before it can connect. Odessa stumbles back, gasping, and collides with her instead. She loses her equilibrium and tumbles straight into the ballroom's entrance, due to the sheer power of her own careless movement. There's no hiding now. The music stops. Discussions end. Every visitor to the reception looks in the direction of the scene at the entryway. Odessa, the ideal bride, the youngster with the golden hue, the one in charge of the story at all times. Breathless and unkempt, he stands. Her features were unidentifiable due to her fury. She blinks, too late to realize that this is no longer a private altercation. It is a public catastrophe. There's a whisper in the ballroom. Visitors mutter, eyes enlarge. A few looked at each other. Some people just gaze. Dominic is still standing near the bar, silent, observing, simply observing. Frantically, Odessa spins toward him. "My husband is you." Her voice is thin and tremulous. "You must support me." Dominic lets out a slow exhale. You can see the fatigue on his face. "I doubt that I ever knew you well." The last nail in her coffin is the words. Odessa gasps, catches her breath, and shakes her head wildly. "You don't mean that at all. You cherish me." But now Dominic's eyes are vacant. Not upset, not even let down, just finished. Then, without further comment, he goes into his jacket pocket and takes out a little package. My breath catches. I already know what it is. Odessa does too, her face drained of color. "What? What is that?" Dominic doesn't blink. Annulment documents. A collective gasp bursts through the guests. Even I feel the weight of it, the finality, the demise of the beautiful image she spent years creating. Odessa's hands quiver as she glances at the envelope. "You had this prepared." Celeste takes a step forward. Cold voice, crossed arms. "He did, of course." Odessa parted her lips, but she didn't say anything. Celeste then strikes the last blow. "This family was never going to include you." Odessa stumbles backward. Her entire world is falling apart. She's not finished yet, though. Even though Odessa's marriage is over, she still has one weapon: retaliation. Her nicely curled hair is a little out of place. Her hands are shaking at her sides, and her chest rises and falls in rapid, irregular breaths. But it's not over yet. Not for her. She will not allow it to happen. She turned angrily to our mother. "Mom," she pleads, her voice lower now, tinged with just the proper amount of vulnerability. "You know, this isn't true. You know they're trying to ruin me." Viviane hesitates. Of course she does. She has spent a lifetime cleaning up Odessa's messes, smoothing over her mistakes, making excuses. My mother's lips part, her eyes darting between her two daughters, the one she's always protected and the one she's always dismissed. "Odessa," she starts, voice uncertain. Odessa seizes the occasion. She grips Vivian's hand, pressing it against her chest like some kind of dramatic performance. "You know me, Mom. I adore Dominic, as you are aware. I wouldn't stop." The tone is icy, final. "Dominic." In his hand, he is clutching something. A stack of papers stapled at the top. His expression is inscrutable, but his hold is firm. Odessa freezes. Celeste takes a step ahead, her expression razor keen. "Go on, Dominic," she says easily. "Read it." Dominic's jaw clenches then, in a voice unnaturally calm. He starts. "A month before the wedding, Odessa Hathaway contacted a divorce lawyer. The guests are still in the ballroom when a harsh collective gasp rips through them. Not because I'm shocked, but because even I didn't anticipate it to be this horrible. I feel my stomach plummet. Dominic continues. "Were you going to abandon me?" He speaks slowly and deliberately. "Cutting. As soon as you have access to my funds." His voice remains steady, despite the slight trembling of the paper in his palms. Odessa turns pallid. "It's not." Celeste laughs softly, unimpressed. "Oh, don't even try, my love." She cocks her head. "That document is legal. The sort that doesn't lie, you know." Odessa loses confidence. She can't control the room. It's slipping through her fingers like sand. Dominic advances a step. "Did anything ever exist, Odessa?" He has a rough voice, not upset, simply worn out. "Was I only an object for you to flaunt, or did you ever love me?" Odessa's mouth trembles. She looks around the room, trying to find someone. Anyone to support her? She then rotates in my direction, seemingly driven by a survival instinct. "You're to blame for this," she yells. Her voice cracked and rose. "I've always made you jealous. It's there. The same old charge. However, it doesn't land this time. Because I don't care for the first time. I don't fall for the ploy. I don't argue. I refuse to give in to her demands. I just give her a look and tell her that I'm not to blame." She recoils. "You've always been like this," she gasps. I take a step forward. I don't speak loudly. I'm not required to. You are manipulative. You tell lies. You keep taking things. And you blame everyone but yourself when things go wrong. As though hearing the truth for the first time, Vivian lets out a quiet gasp. Odessa furiously shakes her head. No, Mom isn't like that. Inform her she is mistaken. Vivian, however, stays put. She only looks. That silence is worse than any insult, in Odessa's opinion. She staggers back. A dawn of realization. She's lost. Searching the room for a companion, Odessa glances about. However, nobody does for the first time in her life. Odessa knows there is only one thing she can do when the consequences of her actions become more apparent. Go away. She fights first, though. Her breathing is erratic. Under the ballroom lights, her face was pallid. For the first time in her life, she searches the room for someone, anybody, to be at her side. Nobody does. The visitors look on in astonished silence. Behind raised hands, some murmur. Some people completely avoid making eye contact. Even her staunchest supporter and defender, Vivian, remains silent. With her manicured nails driving into her palms, Odessa staggers backward. Then she laughs slowly. It's empty and bitter. It's the chuckle of someone who doesn't think she's lost, not of a woman who is one. You all believe that you are superior to me, she sneers. Her voice was shaky. Simply wait. Without me, none of you will exist. Nobody responds. Nobody is quick to correct her. She shakes her head and grinds her teeth, as though she's attempting to change the situation. Then our gazes lock. I come out because I need her to hear this, not out of sympathy or cruelty. Odessa appears diminutive for the first time. You've dedicated your entire life to make me feel invisible, I say in a steady, unflinching voice. But Odessa, have a look around. I saw her breath catch and her throat bob. The person who no one sees anymore is you. She blinks for a little moment. There's something wrong about her, and then she pushes it down as fast. She takes a step back and laughs once again while shaking her head. However, nothing is behind it. No, no. She screams out, you don't get to do this. This narrative does not allow you to be the hero. I let out a slow breath. She is still unable to comprehend. Odessa, this isn't a story. This is simply the reality. Nothing comes out of her mouth when it opens. She looks at her mom. Vivian is encircling herself with her arms. Her mouth opened slightly. She snapped out of it. Her eyes gleam with tears. Not for Odessa, not for me, for what she permitted to occur, for Odessa's transformation. She looks at me. Take a good look at me. In years, for the first time. I am aware that she is now able to view it. The harm, the decisions, the outcomes. However, it's too late. I will not remain to observe the fallout. I inhale, turn toward the exit, and put your shoulders back. Not a second look, no dramatic speech. Just a silent last choice. I exit, entering the cool night air via the massive ballroom doors. My lungs are filled with a stinging, purifying cold. Additionally, I'm gazing at the city lights while I stand there. I can feel it extending past the courtyard. Beyond the doors is a fresh start. The past could still be present. However, I eventually discovered that not all endings require resolution. A week has passed since the wedding. A week when I left them all standing there, stunned, unable to speak, and unsure of what to do without me doing my part. The fallout was swift. I look at my phone and sift through the unread messages and missed calls, the most of which are from my mom. Some people are sorry. Some people are protective. When it comes to losing, Vivian Hathaway is clueless. She has no idea how to live in a world where I'm not frantically trying to win her favor. Odessa, silent in the meanwhile. No mysterious captions or postings on social media. There are no meticulously crafted delusions of perfection. She vanished from view. The way a fallen queen vanishes from the family group chat in history. Still going strong, full of updates and inside jokes, but without me. I should be offended. I should be hurt by being left out, but I'm not. I don't have to be a part of something that never really included me in the first place for the first time. Later that night, the call comes in. I waited for it to ring twice before responding. Vivian's tone is tentative. She says, I know I've made mistakes, as though it were that easy. I remain silent. She lets out a shaky breath. I just have no idea how to resolve this. I shut my eyes, reclined against my sofa. Nothing needs to be fixed. Not all wounds heal. Some people shouldn't. I don't say that, though. Nothing comes out of my mouth. She seems to be hoping while she waits. I'll give a script to her. Let her know how to put an end to this. I won't, though. She finally comes to that realization. I only wanted to let you know. Before the line dies, she murmurs. I receive another message later that evening. This isn't a voicemail, not a request. A request. Supper. A silent, tacit ceasefire. I think about saying no for the first time. Not because I'm angry or resentful, but because I no longer require their approval. I notice something when I look at the message and its weight. It's no longer about them picking me. It has to do with my self-choice. I pause at the little bookcase by the window as I pass through my apartment. The framed moments of a life I once so desperately longed to be a part of are preserved in old pictures. I grab one, a picture from years ago of Christmas. Odessa, in the forefront, as radiant as ever. With a touch on her shoulder, Vivian was by her side, and myself at the frame's edge. As if it were an afterthought, I don't take it up again after setting it down. I move in the direction of the window instead, inhaling the silence of the evening. The metropolis opens up in front of me, endless and brimming with opportunities. And I feel it for the first time. Liberty. Let me leave you with a crucial note before we wrap up this tale. One thing I've discovered is that this family isn't based on blood. Respect is at issue, about being aware of your value, regarding not begging to sit at a table that was never intended for you. I thought I had to earn affection for far too long. If I put forth enough effort, remained sufficiently silent, enough sacrifice, they would eventually notice me, they pick me. But the reality, sometimes it's the best course of action. Walking away is the strongest thing you can do. Not all stories require resolution. Apologies don't always make wounds go away. And that's all right, because choosing yourself gives you the true power and healing. So allow me to ask you, have you ever had to leave someone or anything to save your peace? Have you ever come to the conclusion that remaining would be more expensive than ever leaving? Leave a comment below if you found resonance in this narrative, or let me know from where you're watching. I enjoy listening to your experiences and tales. And more stories like this, real, unvarnished, and full of lessons that we all need, are welcome. Press the subscribe button, because there is more to come, I assure you. I appreciate you viewing, and keep it in mind. Making your own decisions is a matter of survival, not selfishness.